An interesting question that I came across while talking to many people is whether a story is too extreme to mention in a job interview. And basically the main concern is here, hey, will this story come across the wrong way? And especially when you're talking with HR people, they're supposed to screen you on insubordination or on whether you're an arrogant person. And I believe it's a very valid topic to talk about, especially because there are many ramifications of these scenarios. Now, let me give you a quick example here. I once spoke with someone who gave me a rather interesting example. They were, in a manager level role at a very important organization, multinational organization, and the organization was not in the tech industry, it was in a different sector. And he came up with the idea that he wanted to build some software that eventually many of their customers would use. However, their president had a very important meeting with the executive board of that company, and he made it clear that he didn't want his company to become a software company. He didn't want that company to embrace, software building and software in general. And it was a highly traditionally structured organization, hierarchical. So basically this was, a clear sign. And the president told him, hey, I don't want software in my company. So he should stop about it. However, he refused to stop doing that software. And that software eventually, after 10 years, is now, very successful, like really successful, like to the extent that, that person is quite proud of this achievement, so to be understood. However, the story, especially, when the way it was presented to me, it was in a context, hey, a time when I had a disagreement with my manager, in this case with the president of the company. So if you would talk about such a story and say that eventually it was your most resounding success when you disagreed with your manager, that's a bad idea. However, from here to not actually using this example in a job interview, I think there's a long way to go. And I believe, as a business person, I always try to look for opportunities whenever there's one. And I believe that, especially applying for a high-performing role where you're going to be competing against other super talented people, you should exploit every single tool that you have in your arsenal. The tools in a behavioral interview being, the stories that you want to use. So in this specific scenario, I believe that the way he tried to employ the story is wrong. So if you talk about a time when you disagree with your president for the sake of disagreement, and then eventually it was a big success, that won't come across very well, especially with HR people, because the reason why someone would ask you for a time when you had a disagreement with your manager is, because they want to see your interpersonal skills and how you negotiate, how you eventually regain trust in that discussion. That's at least in theory. Now, of course, you could also spin it in another way, but so to be clear, it very much depends on what question you're getting asked, the story that you want to use. So there's no such thing as my story is too extreme to talk about in a job interview. I believe that's false. I believe you should always take it like my story is the best possible story I have for the right question that I'm getting asked. So for example, if that person would have been asked, hey, what's the most innovative idea that you've ever had? And he would rephrase in such a way that, 15 years ago when, technology was not such a thing, I was working in this organization in which technology was not something we wanted to embrace actually, so I made this as a side project. I convinced some of my colleagues, to help me on this, and this eventually became something extraordinarily innovative, and it's widely used nowadays. So this would be an example of of a thing big, of an excellent innovation, or even a backbone if you know how to communicate it properly, and if you're applying for a manager level role, which is quite a special scenario to say the least. So, in conclusion here, it very much depends what question are you answering, not the story that you employ. Of course, you should always choose the best possible story for the question you're getting asked, but the main thing is to answer the question in a job interview. Now, there's also another note here, especially for people applying for more junior roles. For more junior roles, insubordination is a bigger thing. Not always, but, they probably, recruiters and HR people screening for more junior roles are also a bit more careful about this, simply because, I'm not trying to say here that junior people are more likely to be insubordinate than, more senior people. What I'm trying to say is that there are more junior people that fail this test going into a job interview than the more senior people. So that's why, you must keep this in mind. I believe that high-performing companies, and especially great interviewers, will embrace your story, no matter how extreme it is. And it's all about, first of all, answering the question. And second of all, communicating in such a way that it's a compelling story and it comes across the right way, not as you being selfless, arrogant, and, all the other stuff. So, last but not least, I know that many of you have this strategy, that you have, 5 highlights from your career that you really, really want to use during a job interview, which I believe it's a good strategy. To really focus on those 5 stories and ensure that you cover them. However, there's a fine balance, between the question, between the topics that the interviewer wants to cover and the stories you want to employ. So it's always, the trick will always be to find the best story for the best possible scenario. And, of course, not overly using the same story to a certain extent. But this being said, there's no such thing as a too extreme story for a job interview. It's all about how you communicate it and the question that you're trying to answer.